One of the most difficult parts about developing a competitive live service game is the balancing. Overpowered operators can make games incredibly unfun because you'll only see the same few operators and they become necessities if you want to win. And underpowered operators will just rot with little to no play. Today we're going to be covering some of Ubisoft's failed attempts to do the latter. We're going to be looking at some of their nerfs that, after being added, did absolutely nothing to slow the operator's dominance in the meta. And we're also going to be looking at why those operators are so hard for Ubisoft to balance. This happens more often than you think, so strap in because this is going to be an interesting one. And now the first and arguably most infamous operator that Ubisoft has been levying nerfs towards over the past 9 years of the game's development is Jaeger. And Jaeger has been an operator that has basically been impossible to balance for Ubisoft, and that's because of his gadget. Jaeger's gadget is his ADSs that allow him to deny projectiles. When placed down, any projectiles that the attackers throw into their radius will be immediately shot and destroyed. Over the years, the functionality of his ADSs have changed, but fundamentally that's how they functioned. And the reason why this has been so influential is because he's only one of 2 operators that have been able to do that over the course of Siege's development. And since denying things like frag grenades and other forms of explosive utility is super important for protecting deployable shields and other forms of utility, but also to protect your team from dying, this made Jaeger basically a must pick at the start of the game. And because of this, his pick rate would be absolutely massive. So Ubisoft would make multiple attempts at trying to lower his pick rate. At the start, Ubisoft's first nerf towards Jaeger that would be significant was their decision to remove Jaeger's ACOG in Operation Blood Orchid. This decision was made because spawn picking was becoming a big issue at the time, and also because Ubisoft felt that Jaeger's fragging potential was too high considering how good his gadget already was. So they wanted to reduce that. However, removing his ACOG didn't solve the fundamental issues with the operator, and he would still be a dominant force in the meta for a very long time after this. And so they would continue to try to solve the problem with smaller nerfs that wouldn't really be effective. They would decide to nerf his gun's damage in Operation Shifting Tides from 43 damage to 38, and then in Operation Void Edge they decide to change his operator armor rating from being a 3-speed 1 armor to a 2-speed 2 armor. And once again, this was Ubisoft's attempt at curving his ability in gunfights, which he was good at, but it wasn't the main issue, and it wasn't the main reason why he was so high on the pick rate charts. The main reason was for his gadget, which Ubisoft would finally get around to nerfing in Operation Neon Dawn, where they would rework his ADSs by giving them a cooldown of 10 seconds after destroying a projectile, but giving all of his ADSs an infinite number of charges, up from the previous amount of 2. This would make it a lot easier for the attackers to burn through his ADSs, but if his ADSs went undestroyed, they would be able to provide more utility technically throughout the duration of a round. I think this was overall a solid change to Jaeger's ADSs. However, even after this nerf, because of how important it is to stop projectiles on the defense, his pick rate would still be high despite his gunfight capabilities being significantly worse and his gadget at its core being a whole lot worse as well. So Ubisoft would try to hit him again with another nerf in Operation Crimson Heist by removing 5 bullets from his magazine and increasing the recoil on his weapon. But even with that nerf, Jaeger still stood strong as one of the best operators in the game. And this puts Ubisoft in a very unique position. Jaeger is an operator that right now is objectively way worse than he was on launch, and he's kind of balancing on a thin thread right now. If Ubisoft nerf him again and nerf his ADSs, no one will ever want to pick him over Wamai, and Wamai will just become the dominant choice. But if they decide to nerf his weapon instead, Jaeger will become extremely unpopular in the lower ranks because his gun will be unusable. Right now, Jaeger's gun is already considered to be one of the worst guns in the game. And with another nerf to his weapon, I guarantee you his pick rate would drop significantly in the lower ranks, but he would still be extremely dominant in pro play and high ranked play. This is why Jaeger is such a hard operator to balance, because he is pretty much a foundational operator to the defense. Without Jaeger's ADSs on the defense, games would play out a whole lot differently because the enemy team would be able to abuse smoke grenades to a lot higher of a degree, and operators like Ying and Grim would become even more dominant than they already are. And another operator that sits in a very similar position is Ace. Ace has been dominating in Siege ever since he came out, and that's because of his Selma charges. These Selma charges are hard breach charges that can be thrown from a distance, and when deployed onto a reinforced wall, they will expand, opening small size holes in a wall. Hard breachers have always been fundamental to Siege. Thermite and Abana, for example, before Ace was even released, were incredibly strong and basically picked every round. However, Ace is different, and that's because he can open pretty large size holes in a wall from a distance at fast speed with a really good gun in his loadout. And Ubisoft has tried to fix this. For example, back in Operation Shadow Legacy, Ubisoft decided to nerf the size of each breach his Selma charges would open by making each Selma only tick twice instead of 3 times. This made it to where Selmas can no longer make walkable holes in a wall, they can only make crouchable or vaultable holes. However, with him having access to 3 of his Selmas, that's not really an issue because you can very easily just make a walkable sized hole with 2 Selma charges. And Ubisoft very quickly realized that change wasn't enough, so they would continue to nerf him by nerfing his AK-12's recoil in Operation Crystal Guard and nerfing his AK-12's damage by 5 in Operation Solar Raid. However, none of these really changed the issue, And for Ace to really become balanced in the game as a whole, it would take a large fundamental rework. And the reason why Ubisoft has been neglecting to do this is because Ace basically upholds the entire attacking team. Right now, there are a ton of breach denial operators, those being Cade, Bandit, and Tuberal. All of those operators have become a whole lot stronger over the years, especially with EMPs being nerfed to no longer destroy electronic utility and to just disable them. And without Ace being able to open walls quickly from a distance, things like bandit tricking are a whole lot easier, because going up against a thermite, when you place down a thermite charge, it makes a really loud sound and the animation is incredibly slow, which gives Bandit or Cade a whole lot of time to trick the wall. And if Ubisoft was to nerf Ace to the point where he was balanced and compared to other hard breachers, the attack would be in a significantly worse position, and it would be a whole lot harder for the attack to win games. Ace has a huge effect on the attacker's win rate as a whole because of the fact that he's basically just the best hard breacher in the game, undeniably. And as the game has evolved over time, the defense has just gotten better and better at denying getting walls open, which is why I think Ace is in the position he is in. Ubisoft can't nerf Ace without fundamentally changing the dynamic between the attack and defense as a whole, and so they just kind of leave him in the position he is, objectively overpowered and basically a requirement in every round. Fenrir is an operator that isn't quite as strong, but he's definitely an operator that has held significant presence in the meta, and that's because of his dread mines. These dread mines can be placed around the map, and when activated with his activation codes, will stay dormant and wait for an attacker to walk into their radius. And when an attacker walks into their radius, they will then detonate, spewing out a large amount of toxic gas. And when the attackers walk into that gas, they'll be heavily blinded for the duration. This gives the defenders a huge advantage in gunfights when the attackers walk into those mines. And when you combine this with the fact that Fenrir on launch also had barbed wire and a secondary shotgun, he was just an absolute powerhouse, and he would dominate the competitive scene at pretty much all levels. So Ubisoft would make attempts to nerf him in Operation New Blood. They would remove one F-Not mine from him, they would remove one activation code from him, and his mines were no longer bulletproof. However, to make up for these significant nerfs, his activation codes were recovered when a mine was destroyed. Overall, this was a pretty heavy nerf. It hurt Fenrir a whole lot because he could now be countered by operators like Twitch very easily. However, he's still an incredibly influential and strong operator in the meta because of the fact that the blindness effect on his traps are so strong, and because of the fact that his activation tokens are given back to him. That means that throughout the duration of the round, he can get utility out of all 4 traps instead of just 3 of them like he could before. And when you combine this with the fact that he has an MP7, one of the strongest guns in the game, and a secondary shotgun still even after the nerf, I think you see why Fenrir still has a huge effect on the meta. However, he's an operator in a similar position to Valkyrie. If they nerf Fenrir anymore, there's a really strong chance that he would just drop off and become basically useless. However, in his current implementation right now, a lot of people consider him to be incredibly strong. So Ubisoft will have to walk a very fine line with him going forward. And another operator that's in a very similar position to Fenrir is Azami. And the reason for that is because her Kibas were just recently changed to no longer be bulletproof, and instead her Kibas now have 1000 HP and are vulnerable to damage from weapons. And with each weapon type's damage scaling differently. This means that certain weapon classes like DMRs and marksman rifles deal more damage to her Kibas than assault rifles do. And this overall was a step in the right direction. However, Azami is still exceptionally strong on most bomb sites, and that's because shooting Azami's Kibas leaves the attacker incredibly vulnerable, which allows Azami to swing out onto them and pick up a free kill while their pants are down. And the reason why I say she's in a very similar position to Fenrir is because there's only a couple of ways that Ubisoft can go about nerfing her. If Ubisoft decides to nerf Azami again and they nerf the HP too much, then her Kibas could basically just become like Blackbeard's old shield, where it's basically just paper mache in front of the operator and it's very easily dealt with. But if Ubisoft decides to go down the route of removing some of her Kibas, then she's not going to be able to use her gadget as reactively, and it's going to limit the amount of strategies that the defender can employ using Azami. So because of that, Azami's in a very tough position right now, where Ubisoft is probably going to struggle to balance her for the next few seasons. And another big reason why Azami would be hard to nerf is because she's one of the big utility sinks on the defense right now. One of the biggest reasons why Azami is strong is because she forces the attackers to waste explosive utility on her Kibas over the duration of a round, which helps protect her teammates' gadgets like Maestro cameras and stuff later on in the round. This is why you'll see Azami picked alongside other operators with bulletproof utility, so that way she can function as a utility waster and the rest of her team can get actual utility out of their gadgets. So if Ubisoft nerfed Azami too much, then the amount of bulletproof utility the defense would be able to bring would drastically decrease, which would make the defense's job of defending their bulletproof utility a little bit more difficult. So when you combine all of these aspects together, it makes Azami one of the hardest operators in the game to nerf properly. And the same thing applies to Dokkaebi. Dokkaebi is an operator that has been through it all. When she first released, she was one of the worst operators in the game. Her loadout was considered to be below average because her DMR just really didn't compete with the other ARs in the game at the time. And while her secondary SMGs were decent, it was considered suboptimal to not have an automatic primary weapon on the attack. And when you consider that her gadget functioned a lot differently back then and a whole lot worse, a lot of people just didn't really like using her, especially compared to her competition like Lion. However, as Ubisoft has buffed her over the seasons by making her loadout more universal and by buffing her gadget, she's found herself to become the objectively strongest operator on the attack. And that's because of some of Ubisoft's decisions, like buffing her calls to be able to affect dead defenders as well. So Ubisoft realized this was an issue and they decided to target her in Operation Twin Shells with a nerf. In this nerf, they made her calls no longer accessible to her at the start of the round, and instead they were slowly given to her over time every 45 seconds. This nerf realistically did nothing to stop Dokkaebi because she still had access to everything she had before. She had amazing secondary gadgets that could basically cover every circumstance. She had access to a way stronger weapon loadout now since DMRs have been buffed and since everything else in the game had been nerfed over the past few years. And her gadgets still had the ability to deny intel from the entire enemy team, produce a loud audio cue on every defender's phone, revealing their position for a short period of time, and it allowed her to still hack into the defender's camera system. This means that Dokkaebi can pretty much deal with anything that you could possibly throw at her with everything involved in her kit. And I think the reason why Ubisoft decided to nerf her this way in Operation Twin Shells is because nerfing her in any other way is kind of a risky move. If you remove an aspect of her tablet, like her ability to hack into defender cameras, she would pretty much instantly become a whole lot more niche, and her pick rate could potentially fall off. And if they did some of the other community changes that have been suggested, like reworking her calls to be on a per operator basis, it would basically just make her another Deimos. So that leaves Ubisoft with only a few main ways to balance her, and that is to do what they did by making her calls something that she gets access to over the course of a round, or they can change aspects of her loadout by removing strong secondary gadgets and also removing things like her Gon 6. Dokkaebi is definitely not an operator that is as difficult to nerf compared to other operators on this list, but Ubisoft has clearly struggled to balance her over the past few years of her development. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video on R6 operators that Ubisoft can't nerf. If you did, I make these content just like this twice a week, so go subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter if you don't miss the next upload. Now, if you want to watch another video just like this one, a video will be popping up on your screen right now that I'm sure you'll all enjoy. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.